Everyone, and welcome to this lesson. We have talked about formats in JavaScript, where we talked about the ISO date format, the short format, and the long date format. And in the previous lesson, we dived deep into the ISO date format, how it can be written, things to take note about it, and how it works and produce output in JavaScript. In this particular lesson, we're talking about time zones in JavaScript. I want to quickly use an example and then compare two different locations to understand how time zones work. Let's say you are someone in Lagos, a part of Nigeria, and then you have someone who is in, let's say, Atlanta in the United States. Ideally, I think the difference between the hours of the day between these two different locations is about 5 hours difference, which means that there's tendency that when you are in the afternoon here, they probably be in their own morning. And when you are in the night here, they are probably in their home afternoon or evening, which means that these two locations don't choose the same time as a result of the fact that they have different time zones operating at these two locations. And that is a good example to illustrate how time zones can differentiate locations from each other. When setting a date, without specifying the time zone, JavaScript will use the browser's time zone. If you remember from my own previous example, that the time zone that my system was showing is in GMT, which means that is a time zone that is set by my browser, and the output is coming from my browser's time zone. Someone who is not in my location might definitely get a different time zone that is different from mine if we are not sharing the same time zone or we are not using the same time zone at a particular point in time. When getting a date without specifying the time zone, the result is converted to the browser's time zone. So when you get a date and you don't specify the time zone in which you want the result is going to be converted to the browser's time zone, which means, in other words, if a date or time is created in GMT, Greenwich Mean Time, the date or time will be converted to CDT, Central US Daylight Time, if a user browses from Central US. So which means that if a user is from US, a Central US, and then you created a date in GMT, if the time zones are not the same, the person from that Central US, the person from that Central US browser is going to determine the output of the date that he or she will get based on the time zone of the location where the person is present. So from this, I want to pull up my editor and let's talk about short dates in JavaScript. Short dates are written with this format in JavaScript. So, we've talked about dates, how they can be written in JavaScript. But when we are talking about short dates, like it was said in the exam, in the videos before this, you will see that we said one of the formats to write date in JavaScript is short date format. And short date format usually follow this syntax: month first, followed by the day and the year. So which means that an example of this can be something like this. Month first can do, okay, the month is January. Take this out and say, okay, month is January. Then what is the next? What follows it is the day. Sorry. January. Oh, sorry about that. January. The date 12, 2026. And then I can have this. And now, right here, if I take this format, this method out from it and just output it. Now you can see that right here on my screen, you can see January 12, 2026. This is the name of the month. It's not being written as 01, which is the format for the month, but instead as the name, as you can see right here. So you can also take note of the fact that The time zone is GMT, West African Standard Time, which is the correct time zone that my browser is using because that is my current time zone and current location. So if someone who is not in my time zone try to use this example, they might get an output that differs from GMT as the time zone as a result of their own location. So this is an example of how a short date can be written in JavaScript. But there are some warnings to take note of. In some browser, months or days with no leading zero may produce an error. So what that basically means is that if I decide to remove this leading zero from the month in some browser, it might produce an error. But in my own case, you can see that it's working fine and it's not producing any error. But in some browser, you might get an error, which is the reason why you should always be aware of what you are trying to work with in JavaScript. So if you do this and say, okay, 22, sorry, not 33, 22. Now you can see this date format. Of course, in my own browser, it's working, but in some browser, it might produce an error. And also, the behavior of year, month, and day is undefined in some is undefined. Some browser will try to guess the format. Some will return not a number, none. So which means that this format of year, month, and day in some browser, this might produce an error or not a number and show undefined. So this is an example of what that means. So let's say I have something like this, 2024 slash 03 slash 25. Now, look at this. In my own case, this works fine, but in some browser, it might produce not a number. The number three thing is that the behavior of day, month, and year is also undefined. Some browser will try to guess the format, and some will return not a number. So some browser will guess this, and some will return not a number. I can as well change this to hyphen this way. And I think in my own case, this also works fine. Also, and put 25. So, fine, this works. But in some browser, you might get not a number as the output. So, which means that you need to be careful of the string that you are passing in to your date object when working with time zone and when working with short dates in JavaScript. Thank you. And in the next lesson, we'll take a look at long date format in JavaScript.